All right, I want to continue in part with where we left off, but we'll just announce that next Monday we will have one student presentation. We asked last time, I'll ask again, if any other persons and students in the class have something they'd like to present, please stay after office hours and we'll talk. Second, we'll have a distinguished visitor I've been working with from IIT. She's a very creative person, mixing together the built environment, different parts of the world, culture, and we'll have an interesting discussion. She's Venezuelan who studied in Paris. She's now teaching here. She's been working in international organizations, so very cosmopolitan and interesting stuff. All right. Then Wednesday is the review for the exam, last class session. Anything is open for discussion on next Wednesday. All right, today what I want to do is in part continue with the themes and the readings, but I want to frame the whole section a little bit more than I did before. So we talked about Dahl because of the critical importance of the book, the big concepts that you need for studying power anywhere, in families, in China, with national governments, with local governments. The big point is to distinguish resources from actual decisions. And a whole lot of discussion historically, especially, is talked about capitalism or money, whatever, as if this is power or this is a decision. And the point of Dahl was look and see. And most people never use most of their resources. And so the linkages between resources, the reputation, the potential, and then the beginnings of building a coalition. And then people may say, well, no, it's not going to work. I'm quitting. And they never really, quote, spend their money, do what they might do, and so forth. On the other hand, there's a lot of noise, uncertainty. And if you're mayor of Chicago, you never know if you're, last summer in particular, with the Black Lives Matter, the looting, the counter looting, the insurrections, all kinds of things going on. Nobody knew what was going to happen from hour to hour, most of all the mayor and the police. So where and how we get to some of this is what I want to mention a little bit. I mean, that's the recent current situation. One aspect of diversity, but where and how do these big framings of the roles, the rules of the game, the political culture of different cities and roles of police with citizens, especially African Americans, vary, especially in the US, where this is visible and politicized. And we can contrast then, as we've done, we tried to frame the US internationally, but at least to frame a little bit more variations within the US now, comparing the South, California, and the like. And second, historically. Let me do that for 5 minutes, as I haven't said some of these things before. Some of it you know, some may not. What are the big cultural regions of the US? We've talked about Elazar's 3 types and the migration paths. Those leave out the specific differences due to that is, they're the founding sources of each of these regions. The initial creators from Europe, not the Indians, if you will, or the Native Americans, but the 3 European sources are clear: New England, Middle Atlantic, and the South. If we then add, however, big later migrations, those in part change the story. So let me focus on them. The South had more of the original migrations. They were all white. They were all from England, basically. The slaves were called indentured servants, and that lasted for 30, 40 years. Then as the numbers began to increase in demand for more, and as England changed the rules, and the idea of indentured servants wasn't working, there was an African migration to especially the South. Not uniquely, there were slaves in New England, slaves in other places, but especially the South. And that was and slavery, if you will, is a feudal residue. We talked about it in that context of feudalism, different style. Slavery in that strong hierarchical form was if not the still distinguishing characteristic of the American South. It persists in the military, where people salute, people still say sir when you come into a classroom. I asked in class last quarter of the quarter before, if anyone had any, how many students are from the South? And I asked you again, if anyone wants to add to this, please do. But the anecdote we recently heard was terrific. One woman in the class here, USC, I said, who's in the South? You have anything that marks the South as different? She said, well, when I was 15, my mother got a phone call from the teacher and said, do you know what your daughter is doing in class? And she said, well, in terms of what? She doesn't say sir and ma'am. Okay, sir and ma'am are expected ways to address superiors. So the sense of hierarchy is still today imposed in classrooms. And if you don't speak, not bow, so in Asia, the counterpart is bowing, the analog is bowing. In the American South, it's yes, sir, no, ma'am, yes, ma'am, in virtually most sentences. Okay, most if not, all right. And to have a teacher call up a mother and say your daughter's not speaking properly is a pretty strong reminder of how much this is and was an established norm. Okay. You find this in Chicago. You find this in other parts of the U.S. by people who've grown up in part with this kind of background, and it's white and black shared. So the American military, as they say, speaks with a Southern accent, both white and black, because the military was the prestigious, proper, elegant way to live, to rise, to show that you're high in status, to be a strong, successful soldier. And this goes back to the European aristocratic patterns that the classes of the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and the peasantry, the aristocrats were the soldiers. And the model of the South was more the plantation manor, the English manor house, or the European, the continental aristocracy. All right, if that's big background in terms of migration patterns from England, then they were complemented by the Southern African American migration. And today, you still have very few people from other kinds of immigration patterns. That is, ethnicity in the American South means black and white. And they'll talk about Anglos sometimes. So with the new Mexican migration coming into the South, especially Texas, people will talk about whites as Anglos. Anglos include Poles, Irish, Italian, and people like that. Okay. Why aren't there Italians and Poles and others in the American South? The hard workers were the blacks, and there were conflicts between people like the Irish who did not want blacks to come to the northern cities. In the Civil War in 1860, World War I, it continued. So there were visible conflicts. However, the workers, let's say the factory owners wanted workers who were building factories in places like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. And say around 1870, 1880, 1890, they would advertise in Italy and increasingly in Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, etc. We will maybe pay your way, come and work in our factory, and we'll give you a free ticket to come to Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland. They didn't do this in Houston. They did not do this in Boston. So you have in Boston, New Haven, we talked about with Dahl and his historic patterns. The Dahl pattern is classic of the eastern seaboard, especially Northeast New England, WASP, Irish, Italian, then some blacks later on. In the Midwest, you get lots of Eastern Europeans. And so as Chicago more specifically has a highly diverse group of immigrants from, so maybe 5, 10%, 15% is the max from any one place. The largest were the Poles, traditionally. Second, some more generally the Catholics, but the leading Catholics were Italian, Polish, Irish, German. Some and Germans were both divided between Catholics and Protestants. But then you get to African Americans, and they were Protestant. And Protestantism is a critical differentiating character between the small, tiny elite of African Americans who, like Jackie Grimshaw, went to Marquette or Notre Dame, and they converted to Catholicism in grammar school because the Chicago public schools taught you to speak Chicago public school English. And if you were truly thoughtful and had parents who thought about how to speak the English language properly, they wouldn't send you to Chicago public school. Okay, so that's the private schools. The Catholic schools led to a certain kind of political elite. Daly's, Bronzeville, Bridgeport. All right, so the differentiating ethnic makeup is thus simply summarized in that historic manner. What this led to around 1880, 1890, which Dahl discusses for New Haven, but he doesn't do it nationally. The national story, you had the same conflicts between the immigrants who in New Haven, Catholics, immigrants voted for one another, and they voted out the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. There were battles in other places around the country, small towns which were predominantly Protestant and usually white. And so you had these kinds of battles, 1880, 1890, 1900, and you had mobilization in different ways. So not everywhere had simple withdrawal the way the New Haven story was by the WASP. Instead, you had organized by ministers, by others, by so-called reform groups, a legal set of structures. Three main things were nonpartisanship, city manager, and at-large elections. And in later formed legally states like California, they required that you have nonpartisan elections and implied that these would go with the other two characteristics. So the cities, even the bigger cities and middle-sized cities of California had characteristically strong city managers at large elections and nonpartisanship. Parties were weakened. The idea was that there's a public good, a commonwealth. And these ideals of proper reform then continued in about roughly a third of American local governments across the whole US. California I'm discussing, but this also is found in many Illinois suburbs. Many middle-sized and smaller suburbs have city managers at large elections where everybody, all the city council members represent the whole town, not a ward. Chicago's the opposite with 50 wards, but does Chicago have partisan elections with a strong party system? Who can answer that? Strong party for sure, strongest Democratic local party in the whole US. But are the elections partisan? No. We have officially a legal structure of nonpartisan elections. So don't just read the laws. You think you can go into law school. If you think you've explained stuff by just reading the law, no ma'am. No sir. No ma'am. Both. Okay. Legal structures were there. They then got variously implemented, but the culture of reform remained partially connecting them, but partially distinct. And so you have in Chicago, for instance, neighborhoods variously embracing so-called reform. And one of the number one leader was Hyde Park from about 1900 onward, with the relatively middle upper status residents, tending, and then people around the university did not want to have the kind of ethnic Catholic politics which you had in most of Chicago. A little bit then on in Lincoln Park, but then people would, roughly this time as trains were invented, two big things changed. Suburbs exploded, and so you had the sort of middle upper status suburbs emerging. Nationally, you had New England elite private schools, which attracted elites from across the country. And third, you had migrations from the South in numbers. And so slowly before, but then heatedly during World War I, when many jobs were abandoned by men who went into the army, and African Americans came to especially Chicago in large numbers then, leading to union battles. Even before there were unions, there were race conflicts, which were quite heated. Continued same thing in World War II, in part. So then you had the emergence of Bronzeville as the number one African-American neighborhood, especially with between World War I and World War II, and conflicts over many other things by neighborhood, which I've discussed a bit. We may pursue more as you like, but this, if you will, is sort of the national framework. The closest counterparts you have in Canada and Australia, New Zealand internationally, but they go even further in having weaker parties in general, and the nonpartisan style is even more embedded in a more strong English tradition, which you have in those countries. They did not, like the Americans, try to bring East Europeans here in 1880. They prohibited anybody who wasn't from a more English Commonwealth background until, for the most part, after World War II. So then you had Greeks, Italians, others coming in numbers, and then slowly the Asians. So the English Commonwealth character is still much stronger in Canada, where the frontier was then settled, not by the cowboys, those individual stereotypes, but the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties, who were there on horseback, would show the way to a large group of people who could then settle and create a town. So it was supervised directly or indirectly by the Queen, the British hierarchy. And Lipset has a great book called Continental Democracy, how people who wanted that left the Americas, left the US and went to Canada. Conversely, the entrepreneurial, individualistic Canadians would come south, either in 1880 or last week, as these are still going on. Okay, so you tend to get more homogeneity within, but still always some differences. Okay. The third required listed reading is Browning, Marshall, and Tabb. And the first version of this book, I think there are three versions. The first version focused just on the Bay Area. These people are Bay Area political science specialists. They know it well. And I worked with them closely in the Fiscal Austerity Project. We had funding for a California survey, which we used, and they've been doing case studies of individual towns for their whole careers. The story in the Bay Area basically was then mirrored more generally. So the later versions added Los Angeles and then added other cities across the whole country, focusing on basically ethnic politics. Or the title of this version is Racial Politics in American Cities. And so you get this with the Mexicans, the African Americans, and then whites, I'll say, for LA, especially virulently. The San Francisco story was a little bit earlier, but basically across California, you had the nonpartisan city manager style, where the classic one-word or one-sentence version was, there is no Democratic or Republican way to pave a road, only a better way. And the people you want to hire to build the roads are engineers. So there were lots of civil engineers who were city managers and staff of California local government. They didn't talk about politics. They didn't talk about ethnicity. They just said, what's the best way to build a road from engineering standpoint? And they did. And that was fine, to simplify, until 1968, roughly the 60s. So in the 60s, you had beginning mobilization of women, African Americans, Mexicans, some others, Greens, who said, you city manager type people, you're not paying attention to the real issues. And so they then organized social movements, which we call the new social movements, not the new, just the new, and the ones I've mentioned. And basically, they won the elections. They won a lot of elections, but it varied by city. So in Berkeley, for sure, they won. So the first version of this studied the 10 major suburbs of San Francisco. And they won in about 6 of them. They lost in different ways in 4, some of which continued the traditional city manager, others of which went in sort of more, I won't try to summarize, but basically, the simple point is probably across California, the city manager style was voted out in 1968 through this kind of mobilization. And so you had not necessarily full adoption of all of those three legal structures. And the legal structures, I'm saying, don't really matter. If the city manager is no longer paid attention to, as the council and the mayor can choose to do, they don't govern in the way they used to. And so you have diversity and people then moving in and out of different suburbs, in part in conjunction with these kinds of choices that were made roughly, especially in those years. All right, so this is going on all the time as well in many other suburbs around Chicago, around other cities. The big cities in the U.S. don't have city managers. The middle size, roughly 40% do, something like that. Okay, so then within a place like Chicago, reform becomes a political culture which different mayors embrace or fight against, and as well as within the city council. Although before Harold Washington, I've told you briefly, Harold Washington became a reformer during his campaign when he found it was popular. So we interviewed the city council members just before and then after with Bill Grimshaw as campaign manager of Harold Washington. We interviewed many of the city managers and said, well, you know, how many people in the city council are reformers now? And so before Harold, maybe 4, 5, 6. After Harold, 40. So then we asked, so our question then was, you're a reformer? Oh yeah, I'm a reformer. What does reform mean? And the answer for many was electing more Mexicans. They've been discriminated against. Reform means giving us our fair share. Harold's now mayor. We should have Mexicans as well in a proportionate number. Okay, so reform meant different things to different aldermen and to different groups of citizens. And I'm just choosing, you know, not a totally random example. I heard more than one alderman say that. Okay. Like affirmative action, it was a controversial concept and got relabeled. I won't try to go into details of that except to say it was more moralistic, and then guilt was the way of trying to transform it. That is, whereas over time, affirmative action has become more straightforward, old-fashioned ethnic politics. That's a politically incorrect statement, but watch and look at comparisons and different meanings of ethnic politics as we're trying to lay them out here. Okay. The police, okay. Violence, control, surveillance, police. Big chapter. Let me link this a little bit. See if I've missed anything on general. Still say on. I'll skip this. I can do more international stuff, but let's leave that for discussion if we have found, if you want to go that direction. I'm just distinguishing briefly, I'll just flag it between the primordial and the sort of constructed social characteristics, which are variously mixed under the heading of diversity. So the primordial is what you can't change with what you're born with. Other things you can choose, such as to be an environmentalist or a gay activist, or a feminist rather than just a woman, etc. Okay. The quick story of Browning, Marshall, and Tabb is what I gave you for the Bay Area. The Sun and Shine chapter is on LA and basically shows the degree to which this was shifted by Mexican increasing mobilization, with now Mexican mayors and a sense of fragmentation, which marks LA as the most, I'm looking for a proper word here. Putnam did surveys of several metro areas, and in LA, people most often said, I don't trust the local leaders. I don't want to work with these people. I don't go to meetings. I don't turn out, or if I turn out in elections, I don't know who to vote for. Freeway, the television coverage of freeways in recent years has had sort of a police car chasing someone running, driving away at high speed, and the helicopter follows them, and that's a regular, I won't say regular, a couple of times a year. I taught at UCLA and was interested to see things like this. And I trained for the marathon, ran in the marathon to get a flavor of the street in LA and how different it is from Chicago. And then I did the same thing in Paris. And I got in shape for that damn marathon. It killed me, but when I was in shape, I had to do 3 of them. Okay. Don't is my general recommendation. It can create permanent knee damage. So I'm telling you, be cautious. If you're in perfect shape, you can do it. But if you're not in perfect condition, and I I did everything literally by the book. So I trained properly, but just didn't have the body that was ready for it. If you've ever had a broken leg, don't do a marathon. Okay. So nevertheless, I would run through neighborhoods and there'd be signs such as a Korean neighborhood in Koreatown, LA, which would say English spoken. That is fragmentation. And so the LA School of Urbanism folks, they talk about suburban fragmentation. They don't talk about the ethnic cultural specificity of how and why a Korean suburb is different from a Polish suburb or different from a Mexican suburb. They talk about fragmentation as a simple ignoring the cultural specificity of different neighborhoods and suburbs, which are part of the general LA area. That was expressed in an election or debates for an election where you had groups within LA, especially in the county just north, and Hollywood, where people said, we want to secede. We want to create a separate government. And they got something like 40% of the vote, leading the city council to say, hey, we need to break down from the at-large election where we have either totally at large or we have huge districts. And they created about 80 district governments. So they created little mayors, little city councils within each of these districts. And then they evaluated this for about 4 or 5 years. And when I was teaching there and visiting, I went to a number of the meetings and got a flavor of this kind of debate going on. And basically it's amazing. I mean, it's not totally Hobbesian, but it's got an awful lot of Hobbesian stuff in many parts of LA. By contrast, in Pacific Palisades, the areas around UCLA, it works the way it should in New England, almost. Not quite, but by contrast, in the Black and Mexican areas, the headlines in the LA Times are, this week, this gang moved 1 block north, 37 Blacks were killed, 42 Mexicans were killed, and we'll see what happens next week. I mean, it was very tough stuff. And these were related to the district selections of who was the district leader. Then you had in the so-called downtown LA, the old, I'll use the term WASP, but these were the military and the farmers who had their big land in the late 19th century and whose style is still very closed. I was amazed coming from Chicago how tolerant Chicago was of the multiple different ethnic groups, and people who've lived in both cities sit on boards, work on civic groups, say, the civic groups divide into these kinds of patterns in ways that they don't even in Chicago, even though this is a highly ethnic city. Okay. So pushing on, this is part of the background for especially relations with police. So I mentioned probably the most difficult police situation, and probably since World War II, was the so-called LA riot, where the police didn't even go out. We then had the '68 disturbances, and then we had this last summer. What's the background for this? The simple, slightly oversimplified background is that in some big cities and some middle-sized cities, the police did not patrol African-American neighborhoods. They'd leave them to gangs and places like Chicago with Al Capone and so forth. Say, oh yeah, well, we'll take care of it, Mr. Police, and here's some money to keep you out. So it was done in that way for Bronzeville. And other places it may have been simple bribes of that sort. But the gangsters were very important in some places in Chicago, New York, Jersey City, other places. You had many versions, Memphis and so forth too, but these were key players. There's a new biography of Louis Armstrong, which shows, at least suggests, and has a lot of documentation, that most of where he would perform in Chicago was determined by the Al Capone gang, not by Louis. His business manager would confer, etc. Okay, there was a play on this performed at the Court Theater a couple of years ago. So the interpenetration, thus, of African-American cultural style was visible, clear racial barriers. And you had then as well in the suburbs and in some neighborhoods what were called racial covenants. I shall not sell this house to any person who is African-American, would be included in contracts for buying and selling houses until after, often, World War II. So 1950s, these then became controversial. Same thing in Hyde Park, 1950s in Hyde Park. It was no longer a legally white, and so voluntarily that changed. And then I think it was the Truman administration began to implement this nationally, but it was sort of slowly implemented. But if you had that kind of racially restrictive covenant, that shows you how strong this flavor was. So we had riots when you had say, a white kid in a raft or a swimming or a inner tube or something or other. He went in the wrong side of an area and he got killed. So the 1919 riots were sparked by things like that at the 35th Street Beach and then other places. Should African American kids go to the North Side on Saturday night? Absolutely not. In the 30s and 40s. In the 30s, 40s, 50s, there were clubs. So the clubs for nightlife, Louis Armstrong, under the abolition of alcohol, you had the opposite. The whites went to Bronzeville because they could then stock up liquor in their trunk and take it back home. They could buy it there, where in ways they couldn't buy it in their own neighborhood. They could enjoy the crowd, the dancing, the music, gambling, etc., prostitution in ways that did not exist in other parts of the city. Okay, so this changed after, basically, to simplify, 68 and later, in a sense that there was an increasing implementation of egalitarianism, not just in the world, as we've talked about it thus far in this course, but within the US and within police departments. So police departments then, but if you're going to do this, how are you going to do it and why do it? Part of it was the 68, we're all equal, we should have equal racial treatment and so forth. The second big piece of this was a guy named James Q. Wilson, who was a Chicago-trained political scientist, Harvard professor. I knew him well when I taught at Harvard there. We had many good conversations. And he had a theory called, who knows about this? Who can tell us? General education, you should all know this. The broken windows theory. Nobody ever heard of that? I mentioned it by name. You heard it? Okay, Andrew, what's the broken windows theory?
I believe it's the idea of aggressively going after otherwise fairly minor visual issues or crimes like graffiti on subway cars or destroyed windows in apartment buildings.
Exactly. That's the general theory in abstract. That literally the broken window is a sign that there is not proper maintenance, and that can spread. That's the simple idea. More generally, let me try to give you a quick show here. Let me get the screen share. I'll just do one image and then try and come back here as we get someone whose picture I want to show you here. All right, can you see Bratton and fourth wife? Is that showing now? Say yes or no, somebody.
Yes.
Yes, okay. All right, Bratton was the police chief in Boston when this theory came out. And he said, all right, yeah, this is a good idea. Let's do this in Boston. And crime went way down. He got a huge reputation. New York hired him. Come be police chief in New York. Crime went way down. LA outbid New York. So he went to LA, became LA police chief. And here he is in the LA Valley Pride. And he and staff had regular, then New York said, well, we want to buy you back. So he's gone back to New York. Okay. Basically, Bratton then made a lot of news in the New York Times, LA Times, discussions, and then police professional discussions. So you then had many police departments across the US saying, hey, if they can knock down crime by 50% in 2 or 3 years, let's do this. Okay, what did they do? All right. I'm going to draw here on an especially rich ethnography by Forrest Stewart. He was a PhD student at UCLA, and he was studying the homeless. And he'd studied them for about 2 years, living, hanging out, driving around with the police, as well as talking to the people in the street, getting lots of field notes and so forth. When Bratton came to town, what happened? Before, there'd be several hundred people in a couple of blocks. some people just hanging out, you don't know what they're doing. Some would be selling drugs, some would be potential prostitutes, some would be taking bets on this or that. Some we just don't know. But when Bratton arrived, 3, 4, 5 times a day, you would have 20 policemen show up and walk down the street. And they would, as they would say in New York, stop and frisk each person. ID, got any gun, anything like that. So when people saw this happening, it didn't take very long. The crowd disappeared. The streets were empty, almost. So okay, then we don't have that much research on this, believe it or not. It's emerging, but I'm gonna come back and tell you a little bit more. But I keep time down here. That's stage 1, if you will. I'll just show you here self-labeling of different people in Chicago. This is not outside social scientists. You see this extroverted people here? Let me make it a little smaller. My neighbors label themselves in terms of the 5 psychological dimensions now widely used as extrovert. Another name is, for the Northsiders, neurotic. That's an official psychological type. So when that came out, the Bronzeville friends of mine said, hey, yeah, that's for sure they're neurotic. So these are ways of culture, of looking at the overlaps of different labels. So I've showed you this before, the Chicago egalitarian neighborliness and localism, where it's the opposite in LA and New York, which are glamorous and self-expressive in the ways that Chicago is not. All right, egalitarianism and neighborliness translates into community. The label community is big stuff in Chicago, and it used to be, and it is visibly linked with different ethnic groups. You have 700 plus neighborhood festivals in Chicago. New York has about 300. Other cities have fewer. These are visible celebrations of how much people build and continue culture with this kind of connection. All right, with the new egalitarianism, what did this bring? This brought basically more young, and I'm talking about my neighbors in Bronzeville, teenage 20s, mid 20s, 30s, low 30s. Friday, Saturday night, everybody goes to the North Side clubs. That didn't happen 20 years ago, 30 years, let's say 30, 40 years ago. It progressively happened, especially after 68. But then and the clubs would sometimes have, say, house music one night, hip hop one night, and rock another night. So different nights, the same clubs would bring different crowds, and these clubs then led to different crowds after having had a few drinks, maybe walking to the bars and the like. And some of the African Americans would then begin to act in ways that were challenging what the Northsiders were used to, such as walking across a trafficy street slowly, even though the light was green for the cars. If you have maybe not just one, but maybe 20 young African-American males, some females too, walking across very slowly, and the cars would honk. Then the police would show up and the police would say, "What the hell are you doing?" And these guys did this in Bronzeville. There weren't no police. It was just the way you walk on King Drive. The cars all stop on King Drive. The Stroll it was and is called. This generated conflicts between the young folks and the police, and they got worse and worse. And so you saw this last summer, most visibly and dramatically featured. Okay, that's a quick summary, but let's then try to say, look at a little more from the inside, from the guy who first studied LA with the arrival of Bratton, and then second studied Chicago for 5-6 years. And his name is Forrest, the same Forrest Stewart. So Forrest, I want to feature here, let you see him briefly with his own face. And I'll stop the share here, and I'll start the share again. And I'll look over here, and we should have Forrest. Okay, no, it's not there. I got to go over to here. Firefox. Go to.
I think in recent years, the fundamental change that we've seen in terms of putting policing on the national radar has to be digital
loud
social
enough?
media.
Okay.
We've seen this massive democratization in terms of communication technology. Some recent statistics have actually come out from the University of Chicago that actually shows that Black youth are some of the most prolific users of social media, and they're also the racial group that is uploading original content and modifying content online at the highest rate. Sometimes two times the rate that white kids are. And so I think that when you combine that with the fact that there are certain issues that are affecting the Black community in America, when you combine those two, then I think it's kind of a no-brainer. It's kind of natural that we're going to see a kind of explosion of lived reality. While I was doing my work on Skid Row, I think one of the main...
Okay, that's the LA discussion, and let's get I think I've got another one ready here. Let me go to this now. Okay. Yeah, I can't see what you do. So tell me, please, what you see.
It's a picture
Of
several men wearing black.
Okay, that's it. That's what we want. Okay, just confirming. All right, that's one. No, did I? No, okay, I've got it. I got it in two places. Yeah, so that's the. We'll just look at a little bit of text. This is from a Canadian newspaper, Vancouver Sun, January 2020. Just glance a little bit this here as I scroll down. And in bold, local rappers mimicking Chicago gang drill music. Experts say the trend of gangsters using rap lyrics to condemn and threaten rivals started with Chicago drill music more than a decade ago and has spread around the globe. Globalization. Forrest Stewart. Okay, Ballad of the Bullet. He doesn't have a good video of him with this Ballad of the Bullet, so I'm using this instead. He's been doing other things, whatever. But here's the story. And who knows what a distract is? DIS. Everybody should know that. Dis is disrespect. That's one of the worst things you can do. And what happens if you disrespect online? You get killed. I find it interesting that in London, these kids are integrating pipes and poles into their lyrics, even though they don't have guns. They're involved in stabbings. That's a quote from Forrest, I believe. Myth making is a central feature of gang culture, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's there. Here's the book. Okay, let me just give you a baby bit of drill rap. So I'm going to go back to my Zoom. I'm going to get this to stop share. Start share. Firefox share. Okay, just a little bit of, these are taken from the 10 leading drill raps. It was either national or in Chicago a couple of years ago. And I'm looking here for top 15 drill rappers. Okay, that's brief, but you can watch more. Do a Google, check it out if you haven't. And I'm pushing on here with, okay, so Forrest talked with these guys for several years, helping them edit the videos of the sort which you see there, Driller Rap. They took the rough drafts, they sent them to white guys in Germany and Wisconsin who had lots of fancy editing equipment, who would take out stuff which was not tough. And then he found, talking further as this developed and took more shape, these guys were no longer focused on turf. The classic things from Jerry Suttles discussing gangs and lower status neighborhood stuff in Chicago was turf and ethnicity, being in or out, and then violence if you weren't in. Instead, it was the YouTube rating. The ballad of the bullet was to make a video and have your video rank above the others, and that you could potentially convert into getting shot, shooting, but only about 10% or less of the drillers were shooters, was one of the findings of, at least in the interviews that Forrest had done, and nobody else has done this kind of close review. So let me switch back here to close the share screen. Okay, now I want to end, no, I want to end the share screen. So I'm going to close it. Okay. So share screen. So share screen is off now. All right. So I'm going back to briefly, I gave you that quick tough story. Well, okay. Brief overview. Surveillance goes with this. Documented. We had a candidate who she's a lawyer but had some sociology background. She got hired by Yale. We didn't hire her in the law school, and she had studied New York very closely and did a couple of reports. I'm blocking on her name, but there's 3 or 4 people who worked on surveillance. So I'm just mentioning a little bit just to throw out, because this is new stuff, but it interacts with the drilling and the threats, etc. And the broken windows theory as evidenced in LA in the first book by Forrest. Why did the people disappear from the LA streets? In part because they had what's called informally a record. Their name was in the files of the police department of having done something. It may have been a very minor crime labeled that way, or it may have been something more general. But the point is, what New York started doing more actively than other locations was not just arresting people and putting them in jail, but letting them on probation, but having surveillance through the court system say, come back every 3 months and tell us what you're doing, or come back once a year, depending on what it was. And so in that sense, many people sort of said, and then for the more strict people, they could even have bracelets telling you where they were. I mean, that's the dramatically close form of surveillance, where we've had a couple of people have done ethnographic studies of paroles from Chicago jails, where you got more tough people who've killed someone or some whatever. And so they may be out, but they've got let's say an ankle bracelet. And if they try to take off their ankle bracelet, then you get an immediate alarm and the police show up and so forth. So that's the tough side of surveillance. And the people and the PhD students here who've documented this will say this is obviously hated by the people who are being most closely supervised. But when you talk to the alderman, the mayor, or you talk to the people in the churches, some churches, different churches in Chicago are very differentiated within Bronzeville and elsewhere for sure. Most of the folks, let's say general, I'll let the alderman and others speak for themselves. When they have been asked, should we say no police in our neighborhood, or fewer police, or cut back, of that sort? The great majority say no, we need the police. The University of Chicago has a police department. The Bronzeville area went to them and said, the Chicago police are not enough. If we can have the USC police also patrol in Bronzeville, we'd love to have 2 layers of policing the way they do in Hyde Park. And so for 10 plus years, the USC police also police in Bronzeville. So in that sense, there's a division, there are deep divisions over the police. Chicago has a different tradition from Jim Wilson's. The Chicago tradition is the neighborhood association works with the police department, and monthly they hold hearings. So if you are concerned that people in your park are either being harassed by drug dealers or prostitutes or something, you can go to one of those meetings and say, hey, we don't want this going on. I want to go there with my 15-year-old kids and not have this kind of activity. And the police show up and drive away the gangs selling drugs. They may come back the next week. It may take a couple of visits of that sort, but these things are explicitly discussed. And the vehicle is police and neighborhood associations working together with the people who show up and try to maintain, quote, middle-class style. All right, but middle-class style, or let's say the style that's acceptable, varies all over the lot. There are areas on the west side that are dominated by the gangs, and the gangs work together with the aldermen, and they help elect the aldermen. It's a book on this as well. So I can go on with more, but I will stop on that and just mention in a sentence, which we may come back to next time, depending on, let's see, no, today's Wednesday, we got a visitor. We may not come back unless we do it today. I'll just say, if you want, I'm working with Bronzeville folks now. We have a report called Bronzeville Soul. We're having discussions with, and we have two of the co-authors are one Baptist minister and one street front minister, plus others. One guy was the chairman of the board of Michael Reese Hospital, but the others are then all African-American, maybe 6 or 7, including Tim Ewell Black, who's probably the leading African-American historian today in Chicago. And so we've all put this together over 4 years of discussions. All right, so I'm simply pointing out that I've got my, and as I said, I've lived in Bronzeville most of my adult life, and getting a flavor of how this works from the standpoint of the different subgroups within Bronzeville. You have people of many, many different sorts. I'd say that in a one sentence summary, the main thing I've learned about Bronzeville is diversity within Bronzeville. There ain't no single voice. The alderman tries to articulate a consensus. Tony Preckwinkle was the alderman before Sophia King, who's now the alderman, but it's always been sensitive and difficult. And I'll simply say, what we're doing is to try to build a Bronzeville Welcoming Center, and the plans for that to try to link the Welcoming Center to institutions that are still standing there that go back to Al Capone's 1920s speakeasies, to the Cermak Avenue with its history, to the racism of multiple institutions, to the fabulous paintings of Archibald Motley of Bronzeville and the Stroll, Louis Armstrong. I mean, the music and culture and the sports are the things which are, and not being dissing the right person, these are big cultural tropes. All right, let me stop there as I've thrown some stuff out, some of which you may be super familiar with, others not. So ask questions of any sort, and let's discuss. So Max, are you, you've usually got a question. You want to lead off, or are you silenced?
Well, it seems like Ram has a question. I have something to ask, but he can.
Okay, so I missed that. Yeah, Ram. Sorry, I didn't see your hand. Go ahead, Ram.
No worries. Yeah, so the Stewart descriptions on the ballot of the bullet seem very interesting to me. I'm wondering if he or any other political scientist or sociologist studying the intersection between the creation of music videos and diss tracks and violent crime actually spotted a negative correlation, because I was wondering if it was possible for the release of a diss track to kind of just incite a response diss track, so keep the battle online rather than have it boil over into a physical response.
In another decade or two, we may have research that will answer that. at this point, we don't know. I would say is the short-term answer. I mean, his is the first. I mean, the book came out about what, maybe less than a year ago, and he doesn't have even a video summarizing the book. So that's where we are. There are a handful of people who read it immediately, like me and the woman at Yale Law School. But this is so different from what most people are doing that they, it's not quite Max Faber. So, but I'm sure, but put differently, I'm sure that does, I mean, I'm sure we can find individual cases where that does happen, that we can find, as we showed in the path with civic participation and trust, we can find some positive, zero, and negative relationships. And you're talking about a negative relationship in that sense, and I'm sure you're right. But where and why and how is the context and the way the pieces work and how it gets, quote, framed in ways that also need to be, I'd say, built into the theory. So I'd say in that, I mean, I think you can see with that, your example is so striking with this in this respect that you can see how why it should be positive or negative or zero is a big part of everything. And as we have something like, I think the number is around 600 gangs in Chicago now. You go from the kids who go to high school across the street from me used to have a bunch of police cars who would meet them and then drive through the immediate south neighborhood, because that was a tough enough gang neighborhood that they wouldn't be safe without a police car just walking home. So I mean, there's literature on this from Forrest and others. But with 600 gangs, you can have 600 different sets of rules and different kinds of relationships of the sort which you lay out for different reasons. Okay. Life is more complicated than many theories in the way the media try to simplify. All right, we got a hesitant hand from Max.
Well, this was less of a question, but I just thought I'd share. I was talking to a friend of mine from London who's very involved with the drill scene there, and he was telling me about like a lot of the differences in how it forms, because in London they actually have to wear masks if you're a drill artist. You can't show your face, as opposed to here in Chicago where you can be very open, have a public persona. But he was saying how that kind of makes it a different industry. And also they end up talking about different things in a different style than Chicago rappers. So even though it's the same like genre of drill, there's differences in how it's kind of evolved in London as opposed to here. He was also telling me about how like the different neighborhoods in London produce slightly different drill music, and how there are groups that he doesn't like specifically because of the content of the drill music they produce. He was telling me about one like drill artist who dissed a dead friend of his in a drill song, and so now those two groups have, beef. They don't like it, they don't get along. It was just interesting hearing how this kind of like genre that's traveled from Chicago, it originated here, has changed in the different cities it's gone to.
Excellent point. And where and why they use masks or not. I mean, there's a and the policies of the police and the courts and so forth. That is, there's still neighborhoods in Chicago, some of the biggest drug neighborhoods, Humboldt Park. The police basically are still staying away. I mean, they're there a little bit, but they don't try to get into the specifics. But that's major in terms of, and this is not widely talked about, maybe should not be said to, that is, and we just don't, and put differently, there are also many conflicting policies within the Chicago Police Department. We've had a couple of guys who've been in the police department and in the computer industry and taught at the Harris School. And I've been to some of their workshops, and they've got fantastic stories about what goes on. But there are many different groups within the police department, as well as, of course, within the city government. And we've routinely then had many police chiefs fired, depending on who the mayor is and what happens and so forth. So it's hard to generalize. And so if you hear people saying the Chicago police do this or want that, be careful. And they explicitly have many different wards and precincts with different rules within them. Who else? Questions? Surveillance, I didn't mention China or other countries of the world, but the linkages of this with COVID, that is the way, if you look at the civil rights side, this may sound like bad stuff. If you look at it from a middle-class Black resident in Bronzeville or elsewhere, it may be good stuff. You look at it from the standpoint of COVID in China, it may be excellent stuff to be able to trace who knows whom, who's the friend of whom or not, and who caught the COVID or who did not catch it. Once you know that one person has it, you can intervene because you got tons more data that the government has. And this is celebrated explicitly by some of the Chinese researchers, just taken for granted. Of course, the government collects this kind of data and all kinds of things which are, not done in Western Europe and the US. By contrast, the Western European, and of course, does it vary by state? Was it yesterday, today, Texas, Florida say, no more masks and you can have crowds up to 500. Okay, we got big political cultural differences in Texas, London, south side of Chicago, north side of Chicago, and Humboldt Park. So even though this may be risky, dangerous, variation is what you need for social science generalization. And only with looking at lots of variations can you begin to detect where and why they go together and what might be more consistent with what. But it's pretty simple to see the presence of a surveillance subculture and the implementation of broken windows as Forrest described it, combined with the potentials which that gives. I won't use the words good and bad, but say, as the media and some persons would say, good and bad. But I would say, as you've read in Scenescapes, there are 15 ways of defining good and bad. Trying to challenge you. Max?
Yeah, I was curious because it's something you mentioned.
Anybody else would get a call, but Max, you've got such good things to say and you're willing to talk to us about them. From the exam, we know a lot of you other people have got good things to say as well. It's just Max is talking more than the rest. But so anyway, but go ahead, Max.
No, I understand Zoom is awkward, but so I was just thinking, something you mentioned is how Bronzeville wanted like increased policing. And I think like a lot of recent surveys have found that in certain, Black or poor neighborhoods, there is a majority desire to see increased policing, which seems to conflict with a lot of the, social movements and protests that we saw, especially this summer, against, police calling for abolition or, decreased presence of policing. So like, how do we understand that kind of contradiction within these communities, that disagreement? Or is that like an issue of framing, wherein like, if your only options are more or less police, you would say, oh, I want more police, but like the reality is that, social movements are trying to shift that framing to look at it as, oh, this question shouldn't be more or less police, but like instead other resources. So I'm just wondering how like to understand this kind of apparent contradiction that we're seeing.
I'll answer with two very brief characterizations of two different Chicago neighborhoods. Englewood last summer had, after they had Black Lives Matter meetings downtown and looting and problems with the police, there was a scheduled presentation by Black Lives Matter folks, and in Englewood, which is the highest crime area in Chicago, I believe. Still, I mean, it was very recently, and in a couple of days before that, the police in the neighborhood basically said, you must have a evidence that you are a resident of Englewood if you want to speak at the Black Lives Matter meeting. And that led to them basically canceling the meeting, which implies that it may be that these were, quote, outsiders, not from our neighborhood. Conversely, there's a great book on the east and the west ends of Little Village, Mexican neighborhood, and the west end has gangs that work with the aldermen positively and well, and with social workers and with social groups, and they get a lot of money and from the state and from city sources, and they pass it back and forth, and they elect the mayor, and they all work together happily, more or less. The east side of the same neighborhood, the same community area, has 3 different aldermen, and they're gerrymandered, so they're basically only slightly representing that little chunk of Little Village. And so they have poor and, or let's say, underdeveloped relations with the gangs, and the crime rates are much, much higher in that east end of the same neighborhood. So which of these is good and which is bad? Depends on your criteria for localism and how you define localism. Is it the ward? Is it the alderman? Is it corruption? Is it clientelism? Is it ethnic solidarity? And whose definition of ethnic solidarity? All of these are questions that are answered in different ways. In a sense, these are 3 examples. 2 halves of one neighborhood and one a third neighborhood, where each of what I've described dramatically varies in terms of what's, quote, right and wrong at the same time within the same city. So that's why it's hard to build social science and why the media try to simplify. So I'm trying to give you, in general, through the course, a simple story, a clear story, and at least to show how it fits with certain assumptions and more general theories. At the same time, we bring in the Forrest Stewarts, the new stuff, the fascinating things that Luke talked to us about, but which are hard to put into a coherent PhD. So you see how Luke is suffering more than the rest of you. You're just taking an exam. He's trying to build his whole career on this. All right, we're at 6:28. Who else has how about someone else besides these star heroes, our Hollywood heroes, who have always got great questions? But we know most of you other people can write great exams. Alan Rogers, Matt Zhao, there we go.
Yeah, Professor, I'm just wondering, how does today, like what we talk about today, translate on like an international scale? Because I mean, I left China for a while now, but I never really encountered this kind of discussion in China regarding like different parts of Beijing having significantly different like police activities and things like that. I'm just wondering how like, is that just because I don't know Beijing well enough, or does this have other impacts on like other countries in like Asia specifically?
Well, I guess the only thoughtful point I can make is don't try to generalize to Asia from all of China, or vice versa. And don't try to generalize to China from Beijing, because they're big differences. But so specifically, just a country I do know better is France. France has maybe 10 different kinds of police departments, and they're specialized for different purposes. So in Chicago, you may have one police department, but you have very different neighborhood practices. Within China, but let me turn it over and see if Michael has if you have any reference to if anybody's really done any research on this. But short answer is, I don't really know. Michael, can you say anything wise?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know either, but I feel like the Chinese police, most of the time, they just want to de-escalate the situation. They don't want to do too extreme stuff. Could be one of the reasons why there's kind of similarity between different cities in China. That's my immediate thought.
Does anybody know any semi-thoughtful data or research on this that we don't? Wen Mio or anyone else? Okay. Yes, Xin Yi.
Oh,
Ke.
yeah. I have a couple of thoughts. I remember that when I read an article about the Chinese policing, that there is some like regional difference between like different like provinces. Like the coastal provinces are kind of like more bureaucratic, and people are more likely to to go to police via the like official channel, and in the other regions or provinces, like the police do not have I don't know, like the official channel or like kind of the bureaucratic procession for the people who come to the police office, and so the kind of like efficiency is different. I remember this details.
Okay, and certainly the inland versus the coastal parts of China are classically very strong in some of their differences. There's more tight-knit, traditional, localistic clientelism in the inland areas that has been documented in many studies on environmental movements and the like. We are at the end of the hour. We'll continue with some brief office hours, although they're mainly Monday, but as we're having the exam next week, we're near the end. Stay on, especially if you're thinking about a possible paper, and we'll be glad to chat. Thank you, folks.